You're back with Amir and Nazir. Before we get started with today's video, family, again, I wish you all inner wealth, which we know is the overall state of our holistic health, family. And so today, Inner Wealth Champions, I have about 5 main points I have written down here. And today's video is titled Psychological Processes in the Pathophysiology of Disease, right? And so our psychological processes are directly correlated with the onset of disease in our body, right? And so the first point I just want to start with are general symptoms that can occur from psychological processes. And as I go into this, I want to start with there are psychological processes that we may have that are health promoting, and then some psychological processes that we have that are health degenerating, right? And so of course we want those psychological processes that are health promoting, because these processes increase our immunity, both our innate and adaptive immune responses, whereas those psychological processes associated with health degenerating thoughts, they decrease our immunity and decrease the effectiveness of both our adaptive and innate immune responses. So there are a variety of symptoms that can occur from psychological processes that are health degenerating. It's an expansive list, but some of the main symptoms are decreasing gut motility, which causes digestive dysfunction. Also, increase in heart rate, which leads to high blood pressure, risk of stroke as well, stimulating the body's fight or flight response. So now your nervous system is overstimulated, it's activated. Also, the shallow breathing, which decreases a sufficient amount of oxygen to vital organs that need oxygen, and the list goes on. But those are some of the few of the main symptoms associated with psychological processes that are health degenerating and also associated with chronic stress. This leads me to my next point regarding gut dysbiosis and the HPA axis. So also these psychological processes are closely associated with prolonged cortisol release due to elevated stress levels and chronic stress. And so chronic stress causes a dysregulation of the HPA axis. So the HPA axis is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and dysregulation of this axis further exacerbates gut dysbiosis. And remember, gut dysbiosis is inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract due to leaky gut, which is characterized by the translocation of microbial products such as lipopolysaccharides that are able to cross into the intestinal epithelial layer, causing gastrointestinal inflammation. And so once this occurs, again, you have a direct relationship between HPA axis dysregulation and gut dysbiosis. And so now the gastrointestinal inflammation can lead to a variety of conditions. It can, of course, first and foremost, leads to decreased immunity, because 80% of the immune system resides in the gut. It may lead to the onset of different gastrointestinal conditions, diverticulitis, pancreatitis, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, and the list goes on. And so it's important to understand that chronic stress leads to prolonged release of cortisol, which then causes dysregulation of the HPA axis, which further exacerbates gut dysbiosis. And this all starts in the brain. It all starts with our psychological processes, right? This leads me to my third point concerning the adrenals and adrenal hormones. So I'll backtrack slightly and say that it's important to note that the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys, right? And so the adrenals are important because it secretes 3 primary hormones that helps regulate stress responses. Those hormones are cortisol, adrenaline, and also you have DHEA. It is an acronym that stands for dehydroepiandrosterone, right? And then hopefully I pronounced that correctly, but I know I did. But yeah, it's DHEA. These are the 3 hormones that are secreted by the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidney. And so I'll backtrack slightly again. So remember, we talked about the HPA axis. Dysregulation, this can also cause adrenal dysfunction, which then dysregulates the body's stress response, but also because the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys, it can also lead to kidney dysfunction. This creates even more opportunity for the onset of disease because the kidneys are one of the primary organs involved in the body's detoxification pathways and processes. So when the body's natural detoxification pathways are dysregulated, this leads to more systemic inflammation, which leads to decreased immunity, and again, the onset of various chronic diseases that are related to a wide array of health conditions, whether it's your urogenital tract, respiratory tract, cardiovascular health, gastrointestinal health, and immune health, right? And so again, to bring it back full circle with these three, hormones that are released, again, cortisol, DHEA, and adrenaline, it is important to note that when a person experiencing chronic stress for an extreme extended period of time, what happens is the body's stress response is unable to keep up with the demands, right? That the body is undergoing due to prolonged stress. So what happens, DHEA, this hormone, it starts to decrease, its levels decrease, which indicates adrenal dysfunction. And again, remember, this can eventually lead to kidney dysfunction, which then leads to dysregulated detoxification pathways and processes as well. Also, prolonged release of cortisol and adrenaline can lead to feelings of anxiety and nervousness, which also, again, we can tie that back to our gastrointestinal health. The onset of anxiety and depression and nervousness also affects the gastrointestinal tract as well. So again, you see there's just a consistent negative feedback loop between the psychological processes, gastrointestinal health, immune signaling, and even the endocrine signaling that's associated with the adrenals and the key hormones that the adrenals release. Lastly, I do want to talk about psychological processes and the onset of disease as it relates to maternal health as well. And so it's very important to note that during gestation and early life stages that the fetus, as it's developing, two important systems that are undergoing major development at this time would be neurological development and immune system development. When a woman is undergoing intensified stress due to psychological processes, she then enters a state of inflammation. Once inflammation occurs, this can trigger NLRP3 Inflammasomes, which are a type of pattern recognition receptor protein that triggers the release of inflammatory cytokines, and it activates the nuclear factor kappa beta pathway, which is NFKB. So the nuclear factor kappa beta pathway, this pathway is a central signaling network that involves the regulation of genes that are involved in inflammation, immunity, cell survival, and stress responses by controlling and by controlling and regulating transcription factors that control these genes and their expression. Inflammatory cytokines include IL-6, IL-17, IL-B, and TNF-A. And so these inflammatory cytokines are then able to cross both the blood-brain barrier, but also the intestinal epithelial layer and the gastrointestinal tract. So now you have two things happening simultaneously. You have gastrointestinal inflammation due to gastrointestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut, which then communicates with the brain via the vagus nerve, and then this leads to neuroinflammation, which is inflammation of the brain and the spinal cord, right? And so all of this, again, we can trace it back to psychological processes, and now these inflammatory molecules are transferred to the fetus by the mother through the placenta tube, all right? Then later on in this child's life, it could be a few years to a few extended years, right? Their maternal inflammation is associated with the onset of autism spectrum disorder. So children who were in their mother's wombs and were born through mothers who experience maternal inflammation have a strong correlation with the onset of neurodegenerative diseases such as autism spectrum disorder, and it's important to note that also different neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease are also associated with neuroinflammation, which can also be traced to not only gastrointestinal inflammation, but even psychological processes that are associated with health degenerating thoughts as well. So again, today's video, I just really wanted to give a brief overview of the relationship between these psychological processes and the pathophysiology of disease. It is extremely complex, but I wanted to touch primarily on general symptoms to look for, how these psychological processes are related to gut dysbiosis in the HPA axis, how these psychological processes are associated with our stress response, and then an overview of the adrenals and the hormones that the adrenals secrete, and then again the association between psychological processes, maternal inflammation, and then neurodegenerative diseases. And that brings me to my conclusion of today's video, which is stress truly kills, and it is very important that we speak life into ourselves, over ourselves, and in ourselves daily, and that we prioritize our spiritual health as the core, and beyond prioritizing our spiritual health at the core, that we engage in mindfulness activities, behavioral activities, and lifestyle activities that build resilience within our brain. Neuronal resilience, synaptic plasticity, that builds resilience and the ability to handle daily stressors, which there's a laboratory test that actually can assess this, and it's called CAR, cortisol awakening response. It is a laboratory test that actually can assess one's ability to handle daily stressors as well. And again, it's just important to understand how psychological processes influence the pathophysiology of various disease mechanisms that affect various systems within our body. Again, it's a holistic and interconnected nature that these psychological processes play within our vessels that can affect our gastrointestinal health, immune signaling, endocrine signaling, immune response, both adaptive and innate, our endocrine health, the overall balance and functioning of both our central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and so on and so forth, right? So that I don't bore you, but I just can't emphasize enough the importance of really understanding one's psychological processes, doing the work to, assess it, doing the work to manage these psychological processes, and understanding that resilience and protection against disease, it all starts up here. It starts within, and it starts in the mind. Once you train your mind to only produce health-promoting thoughts, life-promoting thoughts, God-centered thoughts, and the list goes on, this truly creates and sets you up for longevity, vitality, healing, health promotion, and everything that is associated with your inner wealth, which we know is the overall state of your holistic health. And so if you didn't get anything else from today's video, I just want to emphasize again, psychological processes have a direct correlation with the onset of disease, and they're involved in many origins of disease, which we refer to as the pathophysiology of disease when trying to understand the origins of different disease mechanisms for different chronic diseases, all right? And again, thank you for tuning in with me in today's video, and I wish you all inner wealth, which we know is the overall state of our holistic health family. Peace.